everybody. Brad Parks with Morpheus Data. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be touching on VMware private and hybrid cloud. We've got a lot of topics we're going to cover, but most excited to have a couple customers joining, or kind of current customers, former customer employees are going to join us to talk about their experience. I think it's always nice to hear from folks who've been there before. I know a lot of you are struggling with kind of the same private and hybrid cloud challenges that AstraZeneca did. In terms of flow of show, I know we booked this for an hour. We're going to try and get you out in 40-45 minutes. I don't want to take up the hour, try and give you a little time back, but I'm going to hit on a little bit of the problem domain, share some recent analyst data, but then jump into a conversation with a couple of engineers from AstraZeneca and talk about their story of private and hybrid cloud automation. We'll crack open Morpheus a little bit, and for folks who might be newer to our feature set, I want to give you a couple of tidbits there, and then cover Q&A. I mean, feel free to do Q&A as we go through, but we'll hit that a little bit more at the end in case people have some questions that we haven't gotten to during the course of this show. All right, let's get to it. So first, it's complicated out there. This is a slide I borrowed from a webinar I did earlier this year with the folks at 451 Research. They do an annual Voice of the Enterprise survey every year, talk to several hundred users, and no shock, cloud did not make anything less complex. In fact, as people are dealing with more use of private and hybrid cloud, one of the biggest challenges that comes up within that complexity is all of the old stuff, right? You don't get rid of any old processes, tools, applications while you're piling on new. So technical debt is probably one of the biggest things impacting a lot of the responses to this survey. And it's something that I hear in the hundreds of customers I talk to every year. So at the same time, customers are dealing with that technical debt layer. Surprise, surprise. The second biggest challenge is all the new stuff, right? So how do you balance keeping up with the old while also upskilling your teams and driving towards new patterns of application modernization? You guys can read the slide. We've seen these same challenges come up for the last 4 or 5 years. We have seen the relative ratio change a little bit over time. Things like cost management, some of those basics around cloud have 5 years ago were big problems because too many people did poorly thought through lift and shift exercises. But I think people have the basics underway, but now they really are focused on modernizing their app stacks and doing that in a way that also addresses their technical debt. At the same time, those are challenges. The other thing that doesn't make your lives any easier is the fact that there are not enough skilled automation and cloud engineers to go around, right? Whether that's expertise within the individual platforms, be it VMware, AWS, Azure, the usual suspects, the cloud native engineering, so people trying to pick up new skills around Kubernetes, security, DevOps. These are the challenges that are a counterpoint to just the technology challenges on the previous slide. All of that equates to a pretty big hole to dig out of. Segueing out of analyst data, though, this is one of my favorite slides. I stole this view from a customer I was talking to a number of years ago. They had their version of this in a large format printout on the side of their war room, where they were literally trying to document the 80 or 90 separate steps that their team had to go through when a developer, a product team internally requested an application, and that application was fully deployed in a production-ready state on the other side. Right, private and hybrid cloud is much more than just cloning a VM, right? If it were that easy, we would not all be here today. But to stand up your clustered database, for example, you need to authenticate that user, make sure it has an IP address, cluster it behind a load balancer. You do have to grab a VM template, probably run some sort of configuration management script to lay down the OS, security agents. You have to set up logging, monitoring, backup. I'm going to run out of fingers pretty soon, right? You've got a lot of processes that you have to jump through. So there is not a lack of tools in any enterprise, but there is a lack of meaningful automated handoffs between those tools to help achieve the outcome, which ultimately is helping your business move faster, by provisioning applications and getting those application consumers back to their day job as soon as possible. In addition to the technical complexity, people and process are always half, if not most of the challenge in any enterprise. So from a developer perspective, things we hear, right? They're trying to move on demand. That's what drove a lot of the consumption of public cloud historically, right? Was development teams trying to move faster than their internal IT teams were enabling them to do. At the same time, we hear from ops that they're struggling. If we think about technical debt, that survey answer on the previous slides, that means they're managing VM-based applications, right? New container-based apps, trying to pick up skills around Kubernetes. Their automation engineers don't have enough skills. It's a big challenge. Security teams worried about not just data risk, but firewall ports, malware, ransomware, other things hitting the environment. And then lastly, finance teams are sitting there just trying to wrap their arms around visibility, right? How many workloads do we have deployed? True story, I was at a POC a couple of years ago. We had run a POC for about 5 days. When we first started, we talked to the VP of I&O and said, hey, how many VMs do you think you have? How many applications in your environment? He said, I think it's about 10,000. We came back 5 days later and hated to inform him, he actually had 25,000 VMs running across his private and public cloud, and they were massively underutilized. So that kind of visibility and cost control is one of the other major challenges we hear when we're out talking to customers. The last piece that is starting to come up more and more is specifics around VMware and their approach to private and hybrid cloud. And I'll be the first to say I love VMware, got a lot of friends there. Morpheus loves VMware. We actually won Best of VMworld a few years back when in-person events were a thing. I'm pretty excited that VM Explorer is coming up later this year. But we do see some challenges and hear some feedback from customers around specifically vRealize automation, right? That's been one of the tools out there to help enable VMware private cloud for a number of years. Things we hear, it can be hard, right? They've updated that stack. They've made it easier to deploy. They've moved to a SaaS model, but trying to connect all of the adjacent tooling in your on-prem environment, back to that spaghetti pane slide I just showed, right? Tying all of those tools together can still take a long time, right? It takes a lot of professional services. It's not the easiest deployment in the world. Also, it can become very brittle over time as you're trying to knit together all those different plugins and scripts. And then lastly, we've seen a lot of shelfware out there when we're helping customers with their own migration. A lot of people have ELAs where they may have bought into the vRealize suite. They're using things like vRops, great tool, but vRA, they may not be using, yet they're paying for it. Obviously, one of the other big pieces that's come up in the last few weeks is the Broadcom acquisition. And it's still early days there. There's a lot of FUD. I don't want to pile on, but just a couple of the points that we've heard and some of the initial analysis and feedback from existing employees even. It's going to be a bumpy road over the next couple of years. And VMware's not going away. vCenter's still going to be a monster out there, but Broadcom runs a very, very efficient organization. That's one of the things they do great when they do an acquisition is lean it out, run it very operationally efficient for their shareholders. And that is going to have an impact along the way over the next year or two. And so we have heard from a lot of customers just in the last few weeks who are starting to look at hedging their bets. And one of the ways they're doing that is to think about a more open approach to orchestration and automation. And that's where Morpheus comes in. So rather than just tell you all about Morpheus, I thought we could use a customer case study to talk about it. AstraZeneca has been a customer of Morpheus for a few years now. They've been very happy. They've grown over time. They've evolved their use case, and it's been a good learning exercise for us as we've helped them with that modernization effort. But it all started with an exercise around their VMware private cloud. At this point, it's not just VMware. They've got Azure Stack, OpenStack, Oracle, and even some public cloud out there. But they're integrating all of those tools that I mentioned earlier, and they've seen some very good results. So to help deconstruct how they got there, I wanted to introduce a couple of folks who were from the AstraZeneca team. So got Anish and Tuan, who were actually at AstraZeneca when they made this migration. But in full transparency, they are both now Morpheus employees, which I'm actually excited about. We've got a large number of field engineers, chief technologists, delivery engineers out there who come to us from customers. We're often their first job at a tech vendor, which is great because they've been in your shoes and I think bring a very different perspective than somebody who has, just been in tech pre-sales all their life. So Anish, Tuan, you guys want to introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what you did when you were at Astra?
Sure, thanks, Brad. Hi, everybody. My name is Tuan Tran, and at AstraZeneca, I was the global server operations architect. So I had responsibility for enterprise infrastructure architecture globally for all of AstraZeneca IT.
Oh, Anish, you might be on mute.
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone. I used to work with AstraZeneca as a global infrastructure tools architect, and I was based out of Macclesfield. Mostly it was tools for automation and orchestration that I used to work around with.
Nice, and that is where we met Anish and Tuan, because the intersection of infrastructure automation orchestration is where we sit. And so to help kind of tell this story, I'm going to start picking Tuan's brain, because I think in the early days, a lot of the front end work around their application environment ended up coming to Central IT, where Tuan sat. So a few of the questions, Tuan, I'd love to get your perspective on, and I think share with the team, or who were the stakeholders, what were the applications they were using, and kind of what was the big problem that you were trying to solve in thinking about helping the organization run faster?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I mean, in a traditional large biopharmaceutical company, I mean, Central IT is the main organization for all IT services. So all of our internal customers were anywhere from R&D IT, so the folks that did the research and development of the drugs, to the manufacturing arm that did the manufacturing, to the sales team that did the commercialization of our products back at AstraZeneca. So and also all the enabling functions. So your normal HR, finance, those groups as well. So we basically, all of AstraZeneca was our internal customers. And then from there, because all of AstraZeneca was our internal customers, we had to support all of the infrastructure that all those applications ran on. So whether it was, lab specific for lab environments to do research and development, to genoming data, to basically the commercial portfolio to sell the drugs, down to whatever HR finance needed from their standpoint, to keep the books around the product and things like that. So it was quite large at AstraZeneca. I mean, you're talking about a company that's probably 60, 70,000 users globally, right? With over, I'd say, close to in the 20 to 50 range of manufacturing plants, right? So it was very large. It's Fortune, I think, 120 company at the time that I was there. So very large. So a lot of areas of support that we had to basically be able to handle.
I don't envy that job. I was a poor IT guy at a much smaller company, 15, 20 years ago, and even then it was a challenge. And the world has only gotten more complex over time. Technology has not necessarily made things less complex. Particularly being, I would think, a highly regulated industry. Pharma is not unlike banking and other regulated industries, but could you touch a little bit on some of the constraints and things that you had to think about around where workloads lived and how they were deployed?
Oh yeah, I mean, that was probably part of my job. Well, a lot of my job was thinking about how we basically fit into those regulations and how we could comply with them. I mean, at AstraZeneca and in most pharma and regulated industries, you had a quality control team, and then you had a quality control team within IT itself as well. So between all of the SOX compliance we had to deal with from the financial standpoint, all of GDPR from the data standpoint in the EU, then you had all of your GXP, which is your good X practices. So that's more around pharma, right? So GMP, good manufacturing, procedures. You had your different GLP, your good lab procedures and things like that. And then of course, all of your health industries in your different countries, whether it was in the EU or the FDA in the US, you dealt with all of those regulatory components. And in each of those, they had their nuanced way of making sure that, you were able to research, develop, manufacture, and sell the drug in the proper way, so that at the end of the day, the efficacy and the impact on users of your product were not impacted negatively. So it was a lot to deal with, and hence, by having that, you had a lot of red tape that had to be put around to make sure that the safety was always number one within whatever you did.
Yeah, a lot of TLAs. Good to hear that. Pharma, pharma, fed, banking. A lot of acronyms out there that you guys had to deal with. This is a visualization we did actually together when I first met Anish, actually a few years back when he was still at Astra. He helped kind of walk through this. But could you talk, at a high level? Don't have to go through the 15 plus days, but what were some of the the major steps and some of the pain points that you saw, Tuan? I think as things went from request all the way through to the other side.
Yeah, so I mean, this should look quite familiar if you're in one of those regulated industries or you're at a large enterprise type companies, is all the checks and all the gates, right? And all of these checks and gates, from the demand process, is somebody understanding that project or that application's requirements, to then bringing those requirements from a business standpoint into a technical layout, to then giving it to handing it off to the proper folks within our team, right, from an infrastructure services team, to then build that out, to then handing it back over, before handing it back to the project or the application owner, to then make sure that security checkpoints are cleared, compliance checkpoints are cleared, QA checkpoints are cleared, and all that. And in each of these steps, I mean, I'm not going to walk through all of them like you said, but in each of these steps, it's manual. It's a manual of intake, it's a manual of build, it's a manual of review, right? And if you see 15 plus days, I mean, 15 plus days was actually quick. If you actually got your server for your application build in 15 plus days, you probably got an award on your project for speediness. So that's the quick end, but it usually would take into weeks, if not sometimes months, right? Because of all the manual processes in each of these boxes, just, because there are much more in-depth detailed steps that are in there that are all manual at this point before we went down the Morpheus route.
Yeah, I would think each of these represents several dozen specific steps that people are going through. And I would also guess, thinking back to technical debt, right? The fact that every team in every enterprise is not lacking for a backlog of things that they're working on. Thinking about some of the big pauses in this flow, right? Building infrastructure, thinking about the build sheet and the statement of work, the actual work product, the active time on a step isn't maybe taking 5 days, but the fact that this same team is backlogged 10, 20, 30 projects at any given time, I would guess that's probably a big chunk of the delay is in addition to the manual effort, is just the gates and the standing in line waiting for that individual team to do their piece of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge part, because you only have so many, because if it's a manual process, you only have so many people to be able to basically fulfill those requests, right? So, and everything was siloed. So security was siloed, networking was siloed, even though they're in infrastructure, storage was siloed, server and OS was siloed, right? So they didn't really talk to one another. It was more of a, give it to this team does it, then this team, then this team. It's always an and then, not a together. Yeah. Right, which compounded the sort of the timelines as well.
No, makes sense. I appreciate it. Yeah, human middleware is always never the answer, and always usually adds to the challenge. So I guess flipping gears, maybe turn over to Anish, since I know when I met you, you were very active, hands-on keyboard with the POC process, thinking about tooling, and ultimately deploying Morpheus. Could you, Anish, maybe touch on some of the requirements that went into that investigation, some of the challenges that you had seen previously with some of the other tooling that you had used?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the main points was we had different tooling for specific use inside Morpheus. Like storage was different compared to what we would use for orchestration for storage. And we had a network, so we had orchestration for network. Then we had we went with vRA for a start as a POC to do infrastructure automation and orchestration with that as well. So what we had was different products to orchestrate their own individual items, but we didn't, what we were looking for is one product to do that. So we thought we'll try to do that with vRA. Now with vRA, you can do that with code, but you have to write all those integrations to make that work, and you have to keep up to it. So as an example, if I'm using an IPAM integration to get the next available IP from my subnet, I have to then make sure that I have written the code to go to the right subnet and get the right IP, get the next available IP from there. But also when I decommission the machine, I have to make sure that I give the IP back in the pool as well, and put a message around as what was used this for, and update my CMDB at the same time. Now this whole orchestration was not straightforward in any tool that we can get to. So what we had to do was we did rely on config management. So our choice was SaltStack at that point of time. We did rely on config management to do some parts of it, but it was not that simple. So it was not simple to get an IP from SaltStack and then from IPAM using SaltStack and then do that to provision a machine. So it was delayed, because if you're provisioning parallel 5 machines, that will be a big problem. And if one machine failed to provision, you have that IP reserved without being actually used. So what the tool that we were looking for is where all these things can be integrated without us to maintain code, and also maintaining the versions of codes to make sure that they work with that orchestration if they are being revised in if we upgrade our IPAM tool for after 6 months, the whole integration should not broke because the API endpoints that we were using or the response that we were looking for from the properties are now changed to called and something else. So we want to be away from all those orchestration part and let a tool do that for us. What we wanted to focus more on providing the services in a self-service provisioning way back to our customers. And that's where the team focus was. And what we ended up doing was we found out tools like RightScale, Morpheus, CloudForms. We were using ManageIQ open source at that time, and CloudBolt as well. So we were doing some lot of checks on these tools with the POC timeline, and our main focus was what was more adaptable, which can be more flexible for us to do that. And we were just not looking for a tool to be flexible in terms of what integration that they have, but also how that tool is written, so that if we have new features to be added, or if we want something, how flexible it is for the product to be adapted to it. So as an example, if you take a product like vRA, new features are released like annually or biannually in terms of them, or bug fixes would be same around them. So that's a long time period. So what you're having at that point is what you have to stick with and then do all the code by yourself. We went with vRA at that point. And then the problem was it was very static. To give you an example, what that mean is if I have a data store cluster in VMware, and if I'm using in my code that I'm using the data store cluster to get the next available data store, which has the maximum amount of free space for my VM to provision on based on the requested storage, if the DRS on the cluster is disabled, my whole provisioning will fail. Now, that's where the orchestration was like very hard coded. I cannot use a dynamic in that way. But if I want to offload that orchestration code as well to something else, I mean, if I am writing that code and telling orchestration, this is what you need to do, then what's the point of using an orchestration at that point of time, right? So you wanted an orchestrator to do that heavy lifting for you. and the checkpoints shouldn't be like very static where it just fails because my operations team would definitely be working on vCenter day in and day out to make sure that new data stores are added. They are doing some scanning. There would be like lots of day-to-day work going on the vCenter level. So I cannot stop them saying that, no, we are using an automation tool. If you do that, it'll break the automation. That is not possible at all. So we were looking for solutions. There were a few check marks that some of the products did. The reason for us more was how best we can tie in all the other products for us. So as you saw that 15-day timeline, we also had demand management that we had to fulfill. We also had quality assurance that we had to fulfill, backup automation that we had to fulfill. Also around things like documentum, a very simple use case, like after the quality assurance is signed off, where would the document go? So it has to go into a documentum system. So that upload of the documentum system should also be handled. So all this orchestration had to be written. Now with vRA, specific things, you need like a skill set. So which is like JS around it, which you need to know quite well to do some of the orchestration with vRA. Otherwise, so that limitation of skill set in our team was again a big problem. So we had team members who know VMware very well. We had a very good admin team, but to train them on JS, they are infrastructure architects, they are infrastructure engineers, they are not developers. So to train them on JS, it's again a big question, and how to maintain that as well, the rotation of that team. So what we wanted is to make sure that use the existing skill sets what these engineers had, the infrastructure engineers, like they had Python skill sets, they had skill sets with Bash, PowerShell, and use them with the orchestrator to achieve those automation tools, right? So that was one of our other point to look at, an orchestration, which would then help us with the existing skill sets deliver that. So where you see over here, all these checkpoints, Morpheus was the orchestrator around it. And then the config management that we used was tied up with Morpheus. So the results of a config management task, like say, check authorization and resources if they're available. So that was Morpheus triggering a salt for us to do. And then it'll review the state, it'll give us the results, and then Morpheus will evaluate if it has to go to the next stage or not, right? So these were the things that we tied up with Morpheus and which made our whole process of automation quite smooth. And it's very easy to remove one part, modify it, and put that back in. So I don't have to break the whole chain around it, because in the back end, it's handled by Morpheus for me.
No, yeah, I don't envy you having to knit all of that together. And I know even Morpheus, right? We've grown a lot over the last couple of years, working very closely with AstraZeneca. I mean, you guys helped inform a lot of the work we did, including kind of integration and things like ServiceNow. We haven't touched too much on that, but I know that was a big piece of work that you were part of with the team. That might be worth double clicking a little bit. It's something we hear about. Probably 60-70% of our big enterprises have ServiceNow. And I know even within Astra, you saw the kind of the position of ServiceNow shift over time. That might be worth touching on a little bit for the team.
Yep. So one of also the main criteria was everything that goes on this process. It is a ServiceNow request, and that request has all these breadcrumbs around it. So if I say I want a server, it has to go through a demand process in ServiceNow. So as soon as the demand request is raised, it's a request item, then that request item goes through this different breadcrumbs, and that is triggering a flow in Morpheus actually. So the request is coming from ServiceNow. It does certain checks in ServiceNow in terms of authorization and approval. After that is done, it triggers a build in Morpheus. But after the build is done, Morpheus is then updating ServiceNow with the things that it has completed, or if it has failed, it'll update the request as well. But also, since the request is coming from ServiceNow, we do pass in the demand request number as a variable into Morpheus. So when the service is getting built, it has a label and a tag with that demand request number. So when these stages are passed on, Morpheus task, which we are going to execute, knows that it has to update this particular demand request item with this breadcrumb and close that item as soon as the stages go ahead. If there is a stage which fails and the stage is marked as failed, then in ServiceNow, we notify that as an incident or an item back to the requester saying that this has stopped over here. And then basically an incident ticket is raised to the operations team also to review what has failed around it. But that whole chain from ServiceNow was the first pass to go into production. Without that, we couldn't, because the front end was always ServiceNow. Over the time, what we also saw a demand was a team of engineers who wanted to use Morpheus as the front end rather than ServiceNow as the front end. And we started that with a small thing called a sandpit environment. So we gave access with Morpheus governance around it to engineers via IDP. And then with that, they could come in, request access automatically. The access is approved. They get a link, they get an email with the URL, and then they are assigned certain compute resources automatically to themselves. So that's like a subtenant in Morpheus. They log into that. They have certain catalogs that we provide by default. They can now play around with the systems that they want in terms of to do dev and testing. And then automatically that cleanup is also done with governance of Morpheus policies, where we say, okay, these machines live for 30 days and can have an auto extension of 1 month. But after that, it has to move in from a test bed into either a dev system, which is approved by QA, or something more than that. So there was a chain also after that where they say, okay, now I need to move this from my test bed to my next system. That was also orchestrated by Morpheus. So it was like a workflow in the actions of an instance. You say, okay, I want to move this to the next stage of managed by operations team. So I don't want the server to be deleted. Once you execute that workflow, the request get raised in ServiceNow, and then the whole thing starts, the whole cycle starts over there. So this instance is now moved from one appliance to the other automatically.
Gotcha. So not just provisioning for initial, but moving it from test dev, QA to prod. That's no, very good. Well, that I really appreciate taking the time. Folks on the line, I've seen a couple questions come in, but if anyone has any questions for Anish or Tuan, please jump in. Happy to pry this apart, peel away the onion, get a little feedback from folks who've been there. One of the next pieces I did want to touch on for folks who might be a little newer to Morpheus is talk a little bit about our full stack, and that might help shine a spotlight on where and how exactly AstraZeneca was finding value, and hopefully for some of your own use cases. So if self-service, thinking back to what Tuan and Anish covered, self-service was their use case, right? Developers, those data scientists, those researchers, those manufacturing sites needed to get their applications deployed and needed IT to effectively get out of the way, right? IT needed to enable the business to move faster, which is at its heart what makes a cloud, right? On-demand provisioning is one of the first order functions of cloud computing. Think back to the classic definition. It's what drove a lot of the adoption of AWS, Azure, GCP, was the ability for folks to go to a portal, request a database, request an application service, and get it when they needed it. Behind the scenes, those public hyperscalers are still doing all of the work. It's not that the work goes away. They've just done a fantastic job of automating all of those steps that you just heard Tuan and Anish go through. While that's the heart of cloud, it's also the heart of Morpheus. So when we think about self-service, there are a few different patterns that we hear and we serve customers for. First and foremost is being able to provision those services into any cloud in a common way, all right? So that teams don't have to become a, admin or get the keys to vCenter while also learning how to go into the AWS portal, while then separately, becoming a GCP expert. Giving them a place to go into to request, either base level VMs with an OS, but more importantly, databases, web services, or even full multi-tier app stacks on demand. That's our bread and butter. That's what we do for several 100,000 applications at any given time. More recently, though, we've seen that same self-service approach come in demand around Kubernetes, right? As customers are moving from VM-based apps to container-based apps, the need for central IT to also facilitate the provisioning of Kubernetes clusters across on-prem and public cloud environments has been an ask, and it's something we've taken on. It's actually in our wheelhouse. When we first productized Morpheus after being an internal project 5-6 years ago, we were a container orchestrator doing Docker LXC containers since day one. So being able to take all of that IP and build it into the provisioning and management of Kubernetes has been something we've been excited to do, and we've seen more and more customers start to use us to either provision our own base level Kubernetes distribution, or enable point and click provisioning of the cloud managed Kubernetes stacks, or even bring in some of those third-party stacks into a same unified portal. One of the other emerging patterns has been taking that catalog-driven execution and applying it to day two automation. So even outside of provisioning a workload or a VM or a container, we often find in big enterprises, there are only so many niches to go around, right? People who are wizards at Salt or Ansible or Terraform. If you're gonna scale that automation expertise across a large enterprise, you have to be able to canonize and take that information, those scripts, and make it executable by other folks within the operations team or even outside of operations. So Morpheus is able to wrap around things like Terraform, even link Terraform resources to phase-based automation with config management tools like Ansible or Chef. So that automation use case is becoming more and more prevalent. And then lastly, ServiceNow and other ITSM tools are still important. As you heard in the case, we've seen that shift more broadly across our user community. Less and less people are using ServiceNow as the front door, particularly for their development operations, but they still need to make sure CI records are updated, incidents are escalated into ticketing systems like ServiceNow. So being able to provide those hooks in a self-service way is a big piece of where customers like AstraZeneca have found value in Morpheus. So while self-service is the core, if we think about our stack, there are really 4 big user groups that we usually talk to inside the enterprises that we deal with. And first and foremost is central IT, right? IT operations, more and more, that's becoming a platform operations team. These are the groups inside your environments. I'm sure you're seeing them emerge as well, that have the charter to create that true end-to-end private cloud, put governance around public cloud access, simplify things like Kubernetes, and they're the ones struggling the most with skills gaps, right? Just not enough engineers to go around. That's where we start. But inevitably, as we're rolling out inside a large enterprise environment, there are a few other stakeholders that also have to get their needs met. And traditionally, why a lot of first generation cloud management stacks fell short is they only appealed to one of these layers. So you ended up with different teams, each tackling this a different way and bumping into each other. The real trick is to give everybody what they need, but in a way that keeps them out of each other's hair, right? At the end of the day, that's how you move faster. So one of those key functions is security, right? People looking at embracing DevSecOps, right? Wrapping governance around these processes. So when Morpheus installs, right, one of the first things we do is we connect to an enterprise identity provider, map groups and roles, and that lets us start to set policies and guardrails around which teams can provision into which clouds, what kind of consumption policies, naming policies, financial policies need to be put in place. What types of golden image templates need to be used? What types of security agents need to be baked into those templates so that security can get out of the way, but still make sure that they're not exposing the enterprise to risk. Third big stakeholder group at every organization are, I've got it listed as developers here, but as you heard at AstraZeneca, it may not even be a classic application developer, right? Could be a data scientist, a researcher, an internal product team, but they need to be able to get their needs met. And oftentimes that means being able to provision on demand, via API CLI. So one of the things we didn't touch on in the case is, Morpheus has a very deep API CLI. I think it's nearly 1,000 different commands probably at this point. A lot of first gen tools in this space, met the operations need, but when developers tried to do things programmatically, spin up resources as part of their CI/CD pipelines, those tools started to fall short. For Morpheus, that's a core design center for us, is being able to enable development teams to move and use the tools that they're already using, but do it in a pattern that is still well governed and meets the operational and security needs. And then the last big stakeholder is finance. One of the patterns we've seen as an industry is FinOps or finance becoming part of a full stack hybrid cloud management conversation, right? It's why we saw VMware acquire Cloud Health a number of years ago. More recently, IBM Red Hat did it with Turbonomics. We're doing it in a single unified stack, not through a bunch of hodgepodge acquisitions, because we have visibility into your private cloud, your public cloud accounts. When you first attach us to your vCenter or your public cloud accounts, we're going to inventory everything that's already out there and start to run some analytics against it, give you recommendations to do things like shut down zombie machines that are just sitting out there unused, set power schedules, right size memory, CPU, footprint, so that you're not paying as much in the public cloud, but also you're using your on-prem resources much more efficiently. We also, from a finance perspective, provide the ability to aggregate utilization in a normalized way across all of your cloud endpoints. So access your public cloud costing data, your on-prem utilization data to generate things like chargeback, showback, or shameback is kind of the popularized way I've heard it referred to. So I appreciate everybody jumping on the call today, hearing from me, hearing from AstraZeneca, from Anish and Tuan. Also want to spotlight that Morpheus is a cool tool that's been called out by a lot of the major analyst firms out there. So Gartner, Forrester, ISG, take your pick. Why are we seeing traction? Why do we think we've got the leadership position that we have? One of the first things that we really pride ourselves on is time to value. So Morpheus comes with close to 90 out-of-the-box integrations. So it helps avoid a lot of that brittle scripting that Anish ran through in terms of his challenge back at AstraZeneca. Being able to simply feed in authentication credentials, point us at an API endpoint for your IPAM, for your vCenter, for your other tooling, and then quickly pull those tools into a framework that can enable you to rapidly provision new applications. We measure our services deployments in hours and days, not weeks and months. And that can be critically important given how fast this industry is moving. We're also trying to reduce a lot of the tool sprawl that's out there. Those different stakeholder groups I mentioned on the previous slide, ops, security, developers, finance. 5-6 years ago, each of those teams were kind of coming up with their own tooling. You heard Anish mention some of the different orchestrators that even within infrastructure operations, different teams were using. If you can get the job done with less tools, you're going to spend less, it's going to be less brittle. We also want to be here to provide an open framework, right? The world changes very fast. You may be on VMware today, you might be on Nutanix tomorrow, could be using AWS. You've got another team that might come in through a merger or an acquisition that's a big fan of Azure or GCP. We want those teams to continue to be able to use those cloud native services or the on-prem resources that they deem best suited for an application, but in a way that has a common approach to governance, to cost control, and that provides you a degree of freedom. So once you blueprint an application stack, being able to provision that into VMware today, AWS tomorrow, GCP the day after that, that's something that we see provides a lot of value, and it's what we're hearing from a lot of customers in terms of why they're coming to Morpheus. And it's not just clouds, it also applies to the automation technology. So if thinking about your own skills gaps or the different team members that you have, you heard Anish, you have teams who likely have some expertise around Python, but you've got somebody who's a Salt expert, another person who's an Ansible fan. Being able to allow those teams to mix and match their skill sets, but under a common orchestration framework, allows you to move faster, address that technical debt without having to throw out what you already have. And then lastly, you have to be ready for what's next. So whether those are VM-based apps, container-based apps, or you want to take advantage of the latest cloud native service from AWS, we want to give you one place to bring those all in and avoid having to restart every time you switch your underlying compute primitive. So lastly, I promised to get you out of here with a little bit of time to spare. We'd love to talk to you more. If you want to get an in-depth demo, have a more technical discussion, visit us on the web, request a demo. You can also sign up for a POC. We can do a cloud assessment attached to your environment, tell you what's out there, start to show you how to wrap guardrails around that and enable self-service. One of the things we do want to highlight for anyone who is on a vRA contract today, if you're moving off of vRA, we're happy to talk to you about some of our promotional programs to make sure we can handle that quickly. We know that vRA 7.x is actually going end of life and end of support in just a handful of months. We've talked to dozens of customers who are struggling with that decision right now. And if we can help de-risk that, help you move faster and address some of your concerns, we want to take any of those barriers out of your way. With that, I will let you get back to the rest of your day. Thanks everybody for joining.